Hello and welcome to Background Briefing, available 24/7 at backgroundbriefing.org. I'm Ian Masters, and today we'll look into a number of stories and issues in the news. We'll begin with a weakened Trump, whose power to intimidate House and Senate Republicans appears to be waning as a split in MAGA emerges between competing factions of far-right neo-Nazis and billionaire donors. Joining us to discuss the jockeying to succeed Trump between Tucker Carlson and J.D. Vance is Jacob Heilbrunn, the editor at the National Interest and a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center and a columnist for The Spectator. His books include They Knew They Were Right, The Rise of the Neocons, and America Lost, The Right's Century-Long Romance with Foreign Dictators. He's also editor-at-large of the Jerusalem Strategic Tribune and is featured in an article in the New York Times, Who's Afraid of Tucker Carlson? I Can Think of Two People. Then we'll assess how much Trump can gut the Department of Education after yesterday's announcement of dismantling it, which only the Congress has the legal right to do. Joining us is David Halperin, a senior fellow at Republic Report. He was previously the founding executive director of the American Constitution Society and also served as a White House speechwriter and special assistant for national security affairs to President Clinton and counsel to the Senate Intelligence Committee. We'll discuss Trump's assault on education and David's recent article at Republic Report, Billionaire Behind Trump Pressure Campaign on Colleges Owns Predatory University of Phoenix. Then finally, we'll speak with Christopher Miller, the Financial Times' chief Ukraine correspondent. He has lived and reported from Ukraine since 2010 and is the author of The War Came to Us, Life and Death in Ukraine, winner of the 2024 Witold Pilecki International Book Award. His reporting is focused on Ukrainian politics, President Volodymyr Zelensky's relationship with Donald Trump, and various aspects of Russia's war against Ukraine. His work has exposed Russian war crimes and revealed the plight of people forced to live under brutal occupation. Miller was previously the world and national security reporter for Politico and the world correspondent for BuzzFeed News in Kyiv, and we'll discuss his latest articles at the Financial Times. Volodymyr Zelensky distances himself from allies in wartime graft probe, and Trump's latest effort to sell out Ukraine with Putin's wish list. U.S. and Russian officials draft new peace plan for Ukraine. And before we begin, for over a decade, we have warned that Trump is both a criminal and likely a traitor, not to mention he's mentally unstable, egomaniacal, woefully ignorant, wildly incompetent, insatiably greedy, and corrupt. Now it should be clear to all that his chaotic misrule must be ended as soon as possible, and until that happens, Background Briefing will continue to investigate and expose MAGA criminality and cruelty. But more importantly, explore strategies and popular movements to bring about regime change as quickly as possible, to restore democracy and civility, and stop the systematic destruction of the United States at home and its standing abroad. To help sustain us with public broadcasting and freedom of the press itself under assault as Trump's billionaire buddies buy up the mainstream media, you can make a tax-deductible donation to our nonprofit foundation, the Public Truth Media Foundation, at publictruthmedia.org or at backgroundbriefing.org/donate. And thank you. And also, before we begin, I want to direct listeners to our YouTube, TikTok, and Instagram handles, where our new social media manager, Luke Susswood, has begun posting daily updates and highlights from the daily programs. So find us at Ian Masters Media to help further our mission of creating a reality-based community in post-truth America by spreading the word. And joining us now, Jacob Heilbrunn, who's the editor of The National Interest and a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center and a columnist for The Spectator. His books include They Knew They Were Right, The Rise of the Neocons, and America Lost, The Right's Century-Long Romance with Foreign Dictators. He's also editor-at-large of the Jerusalem Strategic Tribune, and he's featured in an article in the New York Times, Who's Afraid of Tucker Carlson? I Can Think of Two People. Welcome to Background Briefing, Jacob Heilbrunn.
Thanks, Ian.
Well, thanks for joining us, and I'm reluctant to talk about Tucker Carlson because I find him so odious. But he is making a run, it would seem, to succeed Trump as the next president of the United States. And his principal rival, of course, will be the heir apparent, J.D. Vance. So Is that shaping up?
It is indeed. I had my eye on Tucker when he addressed the National Conservatism Conference several years ago in Washington, and I wrote about it for the New York Review of Books and predicted that he would become a presidential campaign. He would campaign for the presidency because he walked into a room of about 250 people, conservatives, and simply wowed the crowd. I mean, his ability to go on the offensive, I think, is unparalleled among any of his peers. I think he'll wipe the floor, for example, with Ted Cruz, who has said he's going to run for the presidency in 2028.
Well, Ted Cruz, of course, is doing well with his podcast, and but nobody's doing anything like the numbers that Tucker Carlson has. And what's extraordinary is that these right-wing influencers, like Carlson and Ted Cruz and Joe Rogan, they dominate the social media and the podcast world. And why is that?
Well, in a sense, they're the heirs to the apprentice, aren't they? Because Tucker brings on, and Bannon does the same. They bring on these guests and then interrogate them about either historical or political events. And the theme, particularly on Tucker's podcasts, is that everything that you're told is false. You know, you were told that the United States was fighting on the side of the good guys in World War II, that we should have aided Great Britain. That is wrong. He had a guest on who said we should have allied with the Nazis to defeat Bolshevism, a long-standing credo on the right, both before, during, and immediately after World War II. So I think Tucker has tapped into the Rosetta Stone, so to speak, of the conservative movement. He is enunciating what conservatives have always believed, but did not say during the Cold War.
So, what's driving this? In other words, where is the constituency? It's very interesting to see how young men in this country are gravitating to the right, and even some becoming incels because of the hostility of women has to do a lot with the fact that young women are more successful. There are more women graduating as lawyers and doctors than there are men, and you can see that there's a sort of seething anger there that's being tapped into by these guys. But I'm wondering whether they are enough of a number to put it over the top. I mean, traditionally, more women have voted Democrat and more men have voted Republican. So that's nothing new. But how do you see this constituency that Tucker Carlson is arousing?
I think it is a generational revolt against the Republican establishment and against the baby boom generation. There's a story in the Washington Post today saying that a new working paper for the National Bureau of Economic Research estimates that the baby boomers' wealth will be almost impossible to replicate for the younger generations. And the amount of disaffection with the older generation in the GOP is manifest among the followers of Nick Fuentes or Tucker Carlson. They think that they have essentially been screwed by the baby boom generation, and they want a revolution in America. They are not happy with the status quo because they don't think it's working for them. And I think Tucker can deftly tap into that resentment.
Well, I think you could make the case, Jacob, that the followers of Azor Mandani also feel the same way.
There is something of a horseshoe, but the difference between Mandani, who keeps being accused of anti-Semitism and is working overtime to visit synagogues and reassure Jews in New York and elsewhere, is that the Republicans embrace, or this generation, this younger generation of Republicans embraces anti-Semitism as a positive thing. They're not hiding it, they're flaunting it.
Well, that's pretty obvious. And there's obviously this complete hypocrisy because their assault on education and shaking down all these universities like Columbia, et cetera, and Harvard is all based on the false charge of anti-Semitism on campuses. So they're trying to have it both ways.
Now, yes. Now the field will be wide open for Tucker. It'll be interesting to see. I think the Republicans are headed for a wipeout in the midterms, and that the stench of fear is starting to emanate from the House of Representatives and the White House. The new Marist poll, which was released today, shows that the Democrats have an overall 14% advantage over a generic Republican heading into the midterms. And things are only going to get worse because Trump has ruined the American economy.
So where's Ben Shapiro in all this? Because he's I think amongst the right-wing podcasters, I think he's at the top, isn't he?
Yes, but the problem for the Shapiro wing is that they want the Republican Party to pledge fealty to Israel. And there is mounting impatience with that. If you look, for example, at the American Conservative magazine, which is headed by a young editor, also who's named Kurt Mills, and they are working with, they're working with Tucker to try and smash this view in the Republican Party and replace it with a more critical view of Israel. So I think the energy and the thunder on the right, the excitement, is with overturning the old shibboleths of the GOP that were propounded chiefly by the neoconservatives. If you remember, the Republican Party was not friendly toward Israel or Jews until the Reagan administration. It was really the merger with the former Democrats called neocons who entered the party and insisted that you were not allowed to criticize Israel, that the GOP then, in tandem with its evangelical wing, turns vehemently pro-Israel. I think that era is coming to an end.
Well, that shift, though, happened because of the Prime Minister Shamir, hard right Likud. He realized that even though AIPAC basically had its complete control of the Democratic Party, they were mainly anchored in the Democratic Party and they had total loyalty of the Democrats. Shamir figured that he didn't trust the Goyim, and he thought the right wing Christian Zionists were the most reliable. And under Reagan, that sort of end times Christian Zionism movement accelerated, and now it's sort of become the most reliable supporters of Israel. So, how does that work? Because, for example, Charlie Kirk's assassination, some people even think that he was killed because he was moving away from Israel and becoming critical of the GOP's loyalty to Israel. So, what's the situation there in terms of what is going to happen to the Christo-fascist wing? Because it seems to me what J.D. Vance has done and what the Silicon Valley bros that back him are doing is that they are putting together a coalition of Christo-fascists and techno-fascists.
That's right. And the question is, can J.D. Vance split the difference? Unlike Tucker, he is never, or so far, he has not been critical of Israel at all. Instead, he has embraced it. At the same time, Vance has been conspicuously silent about the Nick Fuentes episode. And Trump himself, of course, came out and essentially endorsed Tucker's interview with Nick Fuentes, who is, by the way, a Holocaust denier. So there are multiple contradictions in this coalition that I think will manifest themselves. However, if I had to guess, I think the neoconservatives have been on the back foot and will be even more. I think the Vance's silence on the issue of anti-Semitism in the GOP tells you volumes. And I think that Tucker is going to be more forceful than Vance. He's a more forceful speaker. He's also, I think, more intelligent than Vance. So I think it's going to be a free-for-all in the Republican Party, especially after the midterms. If they suffer a devastating loss, there's going to be a lot of finger pointing in the GOP.
Well, I've heard rumors, Jacob, that the way that J.D. Vance and the Silicon Valley bros backing him see the succession is they know that Vance has no charisma, nothing like Trump has, although that's starting to fade rapidly, that they're going to put Donald Jr. on the ticket as the vice president. Is that something that makes sense to you?
No, it does not, because I think Trump's name, I think he's going to become a vilified figure. I think he is wildly overreaching in the presidency. If you look at him palling around with the Saudi crown prince yesterday, even as the House of Representatives was voting for transparency and to approve the release of the Epstein files, Trump is there wallowing in his gilded Oval Office with this Saudi murderer. And I just think that what is doing Trump in is we have a faltering economy. He's clung to the tariffs, and he's continuing the ICE raids. None of these policies are popular. If anything, I wonder if J.D. Vance is going to go down with Trump, and that would leave the field open for Tucker, who is not part of the administration.
Well, I think the most significant thing that happened yesterday, Jacob, was that the House and Senate votes. It was the first time that the mafia spell has been broken with Trump's ability to intimidate Republicans in the House and Senate into total obedience. They broke with him. It's almost like in The Wizard of Oz, they pull back the curtain and there's this small, frightened man.
Correct. And he's only as powerful as in proportion to the deference that people show him. I mean, the man is a buffoon and a criminal. He's looting in the Oval Office right now. His main purpose seems to be to extort as much money as he can while he is president. I think it's all boomeranging. Even the redistricting is boomeranging. The Texas federal court yesterday knocked down his plan. Indiana is resisting redistricting. Once politicians sense that Trump cannot carry them over the finish line in the midterms, he's doomed.
So back to Vance and particularly Vance's relationship with Kevin Roberts, the head of the Heritage Foundation and the chief architect of Project 2025, along with Russ Vought. And, Roberts is an Opus Dei right-wing Catholic fanatic out of the Leonard Leo school, which have obviously powerfully captured the judiciary and the Supreme Court. Vance wrote the foreword to Roberts's latest book. Yet it was Roberts who basically made this public apology for Tucker Carlson's interview with this young Nazi.
Correct. And that may cement his followers in the GOP, but I don't think for the purposes of the wider election that this is a winning strategy.
So is J.D. Vance trying to sort of the way he dismissed that interview and made excuses for the kind of horrible Nazi rhetoric? It's saying that young people, this was recently when all these chats amongst young Republican operatives indicated that they're all sort of very sympathetic to the Nazis and making horrible jokes about Jews, etc. J.D. Vance has, basically covered up for them and said, "Oh, that's just youthful exuberance" or something along those lines. What's going on with him on this issue?
I think he wanted to say locker room talk, and he knows the energy is among these youthful anti-Israeli and anti-Semite GOP. Why would he jeopardize his connection to them? He's going to tell you that the real danger is on the left, that it's not these overexuberant youngsters in the GOP, but it's really the communists in the Democratic Party who pose a threat both to the United States and Israel. So why should he say anything?
Well, what do you think then, Jacob Halperin, in terms of this upcoming battle for the succession of Trump between J.D. Vance and Tucker Carlson? And of course, it's worth noting that Kevin Roberts and the Heritage Foundation's Project 2025 has been incredibly influential in being the kind of blueprint that the Trump administration is following, even though they distance themselves from it during the elections. The Democrats have no such plan, and I think that's a huge reason why they have been in the wilderness, because the leader of the party in the last election, Kamala Harris, to this day doesn't really seem to have a plan. So, what's the sense then of where Project 2025 is going, and whether that's going to be a millstone, like so much of what you said about the Republican Party in general getting trounced in the midterms?
Project 2025 will be a millstone because Trump, who denied knowledge of it during the campaign, has now ruthlessly implemented it. However, I think his ability to keep implementing it has been attenuated because colleges and the networks no longer need be as fearful of him because his power is ebbing every day as his popularity sinks and his ability to direct the Republican Party diminishes. So the Democrats, how much of a program they need, they will need, they've latched onto affordability, and they will also be running simply against the Trump Vance administration, which I think will be hugely unpopular. So someone like, I think it's going to have to be a younger Democratic candidate too, and I don't think it can be Kamala Harris. It would have to be someone like Gavin Newsom or maybe Josh Shapiro from Pennsylvania.
What about Pritzker?
I've always liked him because he is the earthiest of the bunch. And, he went right into battle with Trump from the beginning in a no nonsense way. But whether he's polished enough, I don't know. But maybe he ends up being vice president.
Well, I like Chris Murphy. He's certainly the best on foreign policy there is.
He's been a battler. He might run. I'd be surprised if he grabbed the nomination. I think Newsom gets a lot of props because of his ability to push through redistricting in California. He took a huge gamble, stood up to Trump, and won.
Well, Jacob, we've run out of time, but I appreciate you joining us here today.
Thank you, Ian.
And again, I've been speaking with Jacob Heilbrunn, who's the editor at the National Interest and a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center and a columnist for The Spectator. His books include They Knew They Were Right, The Rise of the Neocons, and America Lost, The Right's Century-Long Romance with Foreign Dictators. He's also editor-at-large of the Jerusalem Strategic Tribune and is featured in an article in the New York Times, Who's Afraid of Tucker Carlson? I Can Think of Two People. We're going to take a brief station break. We're back with an assessment of how much Trump can gut the Department of Education after yesterday's announcement of dismantling it, which only the Congress has the legal right to do.
Hurry, step right up, keep following the leader. Follow the leader, rock him a sing. Follow the leader, rock him a sing. Follow the leader, rock him a sing. Follow the leader. A verified freestyle, lyrics of fury. My third eye make me shine like jury. You're just a renter rapper, your rhymes a minute made. I'll be here when it fade, I watch it flip like a renegade. I can't wait to break and eliminate on every trade of a snake, so stay awake and follow because the tempo's a trail, the stage is a cage, the mic is a third rail. I rock him.
Welcome back. I'm Ian Masters, and this is Background Briefing, available 24/7 at backgroundbriefing.org. And joining us now, David Halperin, a senior fellow at Republic Report, who was previously the founding executive director of the American Constitution Society. He also served as a White House speechwriter and special assistant for national security affairs to President Clinton and counsel to the Senate Intelligence Committee. His recent article at Republic Report is Billionaire Behind Trump Pressure Campaign on Colleges Owns Predatory University of Phoenix. Welcome to Background Briefing, David Halperin.
Thank you, Ian.
So on Tuesday, the Trump administration announced the effective dissolution of the Department of Education, splitting off most of its functions to different agencies. A lot go to the Department of Labor, The Office of Indian Education will be administered by the Department of the Interior. Foreign medical accreditation will move to the Department of Health and Human Services. International education, foreign language studies programs, the Fulbright Hays program will be overseen by the Department of State, and the Department of Education will still have the federal student aid program along with an eviscerated Office of Civil Rights, which will probably bring back segregation in American education. So it's radical, it's shocking, it's disgraceful, but can it all happen? Because it should only the Congress created the Department of Education, and only the Congress can dissolve it.
That's right. That is clear. That's what I would have told you if you'd asked me that. The appropriations laws written by Congress are pretty clear and in effect right now prohibit the Department of Education from transferring funds and entire programs like this from one agency to the other to another. Trump administration cited a bunch of legal authorities, but as with many assertions of legal authority by this administration, they do not stand up to basic scrutiny. What they're doing is not only unwise from a policy perspective, it is illegal.
But this is a long-standing sort of jihad on the part of the Republican right, going back to Ronald Reagan. What is it that they don't like about the Department of Education?
Well, they don't like that it's government. They don't like that it's committed to equal opportunity and equal rights. They don't like the idea that the government might be doing something to try to make it so that you could go to college even if your parents are not rich. And they just like just generally the idea of anti-government. But this administration, of course, puts a new spin on it because they add to the small government tradition of Republicans an extraordinary amount of corruption, so that agencies are by and for the Trump family, Trump cronies, people who contributed to the Republican Party. So they don't like things like an agency that's going to crack down on an issue that we've discussed quite a bit on this program over the years, predatory for-profit colleges. The donors to the Trump campaign who own those colleges want to be able to operate unfettered, get most of their money from taxpayers, and use it to rip off students and ruin their lives. And this brand of Republican, the corrupt Trump Republican, likes an agency that will get out of the way and allow this to happen.
And an example of that, of course, would be the private equity billionaire Mark Rowan, who is behind the Trump administration's campaign to pressure these U.S. universities, including Brown, MIT, University of Virginia, UCLA, etc., or UC in general. He's the CEO of Apollo Global Management that owns the University of Phoenix, which is probably the leading predatory organization in terms of this ripoff scam of private colleges, federally funded, where almost every dollar that they get comes from the federal government. And what they do is that they advertise like crazy, promise all kinds of wonderful things to these students and kids that want to get a better life and a better future. A lot of them are vets, and then saddle them with a lifetime of debt and a worthless diploma.
That's right. And, Mark Rowan was outed and then gladly accepted the mantle of being the person behind these letters that basically said, you'll get more federal money if you'll accept a bunch of right-wing priorities like protecting conservative ideas, getting rid of affirmative action, recognizing that academic freedom is not absolute, limiting campus protests, and rejecting transgender identity. But then he added to this menu, and he wrote about it in a New York Times op-ed, as well as was in this pressure letter to the universities, that we have to stop having schools with outrageous costs that put students in debt with poor outcomes. Hilarious, unbelievably hypocritical, because the University of Phoenix has been the poster child for exactly that kind of predatory school, taking almost 90% of their revenue from taxpayers, abysmal graduation rates as low as 4% at times. Only 10% of former University of Phoenix students have paid off their student loans or even making any progress in doing so. The school has faced numerous law enforcement actions for deceptive practices from the Federal Trade Commission and state attorneys general. And then he's out there saying, well, we have to do something to protect these poor students. It is the ultimate example of an entitled, rich person trying to, dictate what our policy should be, and at the same time completely undermining the values he claims to support and in order to make money.
And of course, the other aspect of hypocrisy is that so much of Trump's attack on higher education, and particularly the Ivy Leagues like Harvard, is based upon the lie that anti-Semitism is rampant on campuses. At the same time, this is an administration and a Republican Party that's playing footsie with young Nazis like Nick Fuentes, who had Thanksgiving with Trump a few years back.
Yeah, it's crazy the way the Republicans party both is now acting in the Trump administration, yes, to save the Jews and at the same time to hang with the Nazis. It's bizarre, and it could only come from this weird president and administration.
And how much are they benefiting directly, the Trump family? I mean, they've just been hosting the Saudi Prince Bonesaw. Obviously, all kinds of money's changing hands there and into the Trump family, particularly from the son-in-law, Jared Kushner, who's got 2 billion from the Saudis, the Emiratis, a couple of billion in the Trump family crypto scam, World Liberty Financial. So we know what's going on there. And today, of course, all of these U.S. CEOs are meeting with Saudi officials to all get in on the act. So it's an obscene carnival of greed that we've seen in the White House in these last 2 days. What's he do in terms of the grift on the Trump family? What are they doing in terms of the education sector?
Well, you will recall Trump University, and that's not in existence anymore. I guess it could come back. But I think that if these colleges, these predatory colleges want Trump's sympathy, they can remind him that his college was treated very unfairly. He had to pay $25 million to deal with claims that this was basically the same playbook as these for-profit schools. This was an unaccredited real estate school, Trump University, but same playbook, using pressure tactics from a literal playbook, teaching their recruiters to get people to believe that their dreams can only be achieved if they give their money to a school that turned out to be worthless and produce, no good results for most of the people there. So he comes from scam world. He's a number of scams, including Trump University and his Trump Foundation, which was shut down because he was basically looting it and using it as a piggy bank for himself. And I don't know anything right now that they've got going that relates to higher education or K-12 education. But I imagine if it were lucrative enough and somebody presented them an offer, they'd get into it. But what this reorganization that they announced, Secretary McMahon announced yesterday as part of her final mission to abolish the department, what it does illegally is send a lot of federal programs that are used, for example, in higher education and K-12 education to help people who are disadvantaged get a leg up and move them to other agencies that don't have experience with this, move things to the states. You will probably drive out a lot of the experts in the department. They've already gutted the department. Nearly half the employees are gone from January 20th when Trump was inaugurated, and just sort of move them into a patchwork of different agencies that lack expertise. Again, the experts will probably leave, and these programs will continue. If they do continue, they'll be worse administered. If they don't continue, then all kinds of things like historically black colleges, Native American oriented schools, other minority serving institutions, programs for now they may eventually move to something more controversial, which is getting rid of moving out of the department programs for the disabled. All of that will mean that the most vulnerable people, the people who've been most disadvantaged, will have less protection, less of an advocate fighting for them in Washington to give them an opportunity to improve themselves through education. And long term, that will also hurt our economy when so many people are left behind.
So when you say, David Halperin, that only the Congress can dissolve the Department of Education, Trump and Elon Musk are already doing it, right? By purging it and ripping through it and getting rid of half of the employees. Aren't they doing this? The very thing that only the Congress can do?
Well, they're doing it by other means. Yeah, they're driving people out. and they're doing these illegal things that will maybe ultimately be rejected by the courts, but in the meantime, there'll be a lot of carnage. So yeah, if you have a president willing to violate the law and try to get around the law, then you can effectively achieve a lot of the same things. I mean, as with a lot of policy areas, I think we just have to hope that a combination of people marching in the streets, exposure of scandals by the media, and action in the courts will kind of stall a bunch of this stuff until we hope and pray that this radical right-wing leadership in the Congress is pushed out in the elections in a couple years, if there are fair elections, and that we get rid of the this Trump version of the Republican Party at least by the time of the next presidential election. And I think we can do it. I truly, I spend a lot of time trying to tell people don't give up. Our country has never been a democratic paradise. This is the most we've gone backwards in 250 years. But we've had slavery, women couldn't vote. We had torture in the last Republican administration. And in a lot of other countries, they have it a lot worse, and people keep fighting. So I think for no one should give up at this point on our experiment with democracy, and nobody should accept this what is really a fascist authoritarian government in power. There's all kinds of ways we can weaken it over the next 3 years, and I think we'll be able to get a lot done. It'll be revolting, it'll be upsetting, and the Trump family will have amassed so much money that they will be a force in our country for, eons. But there's so many ways that we can fight back, and we should continue to do so.
Well, it does seem that the mob boss mafia style of governance that Trump represents, he's a wannabe mob boss and a wannabe dictator, that it's starting to crack. The spell has been broken. His extortion over the Republicans in the House and Senate, where they've been cowering and under his dictates, that spell seems to have been broken by the release of the Epstein files. So do you see that as an encouraging sign?
Maybe slightly, but they didn't change their view on Epstein until Trump let them. And yeah, he felt the pressure. It seemed like it was inevitable because the votes might have been there. Um, but I think that there's a long way to go from that. Most of them are still slaves of Trump. Most of them are still afraid of being primaried. I don't think that we are going to, as a country, anytime soon win the fight for the Republican Party and take it out of the hands of MAGA criminals. I think that the only way out of this is to outvote them in the midterms and in the presidential election. And then maybe the Republican Party, every 4 years, the party that loses says, oh my God, our party is a disaster. And that's what we want to get to. The only way the Republicans are going to change and become a somewhat more honest and decent party, I think, is if they lose an election.
Well, it does seem that, maybe to some extent the spell is broken, but I think the cynicism in terms of Trump doing an about face on the Epstein files. I did a piece yesterday with Ken Clipperstein where he pointed out that in the law that was just passed, in the writing of the law, only unclassified material will be released to the public. And Trump controls what gets classified and what doesn't.
And also you have an absolutely crooked Department of Justice, the worst attorney general in our history, Pam Bondi, even worse than I thought she would be. I wouldn't put it beyond them just to put documents in their pocket and just hope that they don't come out. So it doesn't have to just be classified. They can just protect stuff from their friends, and all the stuff on Larry Summers will come out. Maybe none of the remaining stuff on Donald Trump will come out.
Right. Well, is there any little bit of optimism that we can leave our listeners with, David, in the last
I've
minute here?
already tried. I mean, I'm telling you, I think we have a chance to defeat a lot of this stuff. There's nothing I can say good about Donald Trump, J.D. Vance, Pam Bondi, Pete Hegseth, Mike Johnson, even John Thune, just a basic old country club Republican from the West, is now just a MAGA person. The only thing I can say is that we have more people in the country against them than for them. And through organizing more protests going to court every time that there's something illegal that happens, and getting ready to prevent cheating and make sure everyone gets out to vote, we can get rid of these people and send Trump back to his golf course and make sure his successors don't run the government. But I think we can do it. And their record is so bad for working people, for regular people, for rich people, for anybody. This is terrible for our country, what they're doing to the climate, what they're doing to honesty of government, what they're doing to civil rights, that you'd have to be just a pure venal racist who feels you could be impervious to any other problem to want to keep voting for this crap. So I'm very optimistic that we can drive these people out and get our country back.
Well, David Halperin, thank you very much for joining us here today.
Thank you as always for having me.
And again, I've been speaking with David Halperin, who's a senior fellow at Republic Report. He was previously the founding executive director of the American Constitution Society. He also served as a White House speechwriter and a special assistant for national security affairs to President Clinton and counsel to the Senate Intelligence Committee. And his recent article in Republic Report is "Billionaire Behind Trump Pressure Campaign on Colleges Owns Predatory University of Phoenix." We're going to take a brief station break. We're back looking into how corruption in Ukraine is weakening Vladimir Zelensky and Trump's latest efforts to sell out Ukraine with Putin's wish list.
When some outbreaker tries to put me down and says his school is great, I tell him right away, now what's the matter, buddy? Ain't you heard of my school? It's #1 in the state. So be true to your school, guys, just like you would to your girl, guys. Be true to your school.
Welcome back. I'm Ian Masters, and this is Background Briefing, available 24/7 at backgroundbriefing.org. And joining us now is Christopher Miller, the Financial Times chief Ukraine correspondent, who has lived and reported from Ukraine since 2010. He's the author of The War Came to Us, Life and Death in Ukraine, winner of the 2024 Witold Pilecki International Book Award. His reporting is focused on Ukrainian politics, President Volodymyr Zelensky's relationship with Donald Trump, and various aspects of Russia's war against Ukraine. His work has also exposed Russian war crimes and revealed the plight of people forced to live under brutal occupation. And he was previously a world and national security reporter for Politico and a world correspondent for BuzzFeed News in Kyiv. And his latest articles at the Financial Times include U.S. and Russian officials draft new peace plan for Ukraine, and Volodymyr Zelensky distances himself from allies in wartime graft probe. Welcome to Background Briefing, Christopher Miller.
It's my pleasure to join you. Thanks for having me on.
Well, thanks for joining us. And before we get into your article on U.S. Russian officials drafting a new peace plan, which, having read your article, it seems as though it's Putin's wish list, but what do you think is happening in terms of having the Russian negotiator over here, Kamil Dmitriev, the head of the Sovereign Wealth Fund? Without being too cynical, when you look at what's happening with Trump in the Oval Office fading MBS, and now today there's that big meeting of a bunch of U.S. corporate leaders and others trying to get in on the trough to soak up all that money, and a lot of money has gone into the Trump family from Saudi Arabia. So, and it would seem to me that the backlash now happening on the right of the Republican Party indicates that they're not thrilled with these foreign policy exploits of Trump, and they'd rather he deal with kitchen table issues. So how much do you think this is being driven by perhaps some kind of financial reward at the end of the rainbow for Donald Trump from the Russians?
Yeah, well, we know Donald Trump likes to make deals. He has dangled carrots in front of Russian President Vladimir Putin before to try to bring his war to an end in Ukraine, and said, why don't we cut, big, beautiful economic deals together? If we can just get this war finished and done with, we can work together on economic issues and construction deals and whatnot. He's said, that the end of the war could bring the lifting of Russian sanctions, which is something Russia would certainly like. I think Donald Trump also has this sort of nostalgia for a Russia of the 80s that he had visited and liked. He also has this affinity for strongmen. You mentioned his recent meeting in the White House Oval Office with MBS. He's spoken very, very flatteringly of Vladimir Putin in the past. So I think he already has this sort of affinity for Russia and for Putin, and certainly he's lent an ear to Putin and his envoys when it comes to the war in Ukraine. I think, right now, why we're seeing Kirill Dmitriev, Russia's envoy, on this meeting with Steve Witkoff, Trump's Russia envoy, is because both Russia and the US, the Trump administration, see opportunities here with a Zelensky who is weakened at home amid the biggest domestic corruption political scandal of his presidency, a Russian army that's still on the march, even if it is taking heavy casualties, a Russian army that's, with unfortunately relatively good success, pounding the Ukrainian critical infrastructure, including its energy sector, and plunging millions of people into darkness and cutting their heating and water, just as we approach winter in Ukraine, which is notoriously difficult period of time. And also on top of all of that, a really impatient Donald Trump, who has oscillated his position on the Russia-Ukraine war since he took office. We saw this big blowout with Zelensky in the Oval Office back in February, only for Trump to sort of come around and express his frustration with Putin over the summer, and then again to roll out the red carpet literally for him in Alaska, and then again show his frustration by ending that early and allowing the Ukrainians some greater intelligence and weapon systems that allow them to strike deep inside Russia when he again grew frustrated with Putin. Now I'd say we're back with Trump really showing that he's grown tired of this war. He wants it over, and he's willing to use his power and leverage, not on the aggressor here, Russia and Vladimir Putin, which would take time, and it would mean likely greater sanctions, possibly more weapon systems to Ukraine, all things that he views as potentially further escalating the conflict, and instead using his power and leverage here to try to force the weaker party, the invaded Ukraine, to make really impalatable concessions to end this years-long war.
And Christopher, why do you think it is that Trump never uses the considerable leverage that the US has? He threatens, recently he threatened tomahawks, etc., but he never delivers. He backs down at the end of the day.
Yeah, he does. He does. I think it was one of my colleagues at the FT that actually coined the term taco. What is it? Trump always chickens out, right? The Ukrainians have come around to using that term quite a lot too, because Donald Trump has spoken about possibly sending Tomahawk missiles to Ukraine. But I think the Russians have seen right through that threat, that it's an empty threat, that Trump is not seriously considering sending those weapons there, that he was sort of dangling it over Russia as a potential threat unless it came to the negotiating table. But he didn't have to wait long before Russia saw an opening, and Trump himself saw an opening in Zelensky being weakened a bit at home and under pressure, and using the power of the White House here to try to nudge them to the negotiating table. I think it's important just to underscore that what is being discussed in this plan and in our reporting with the Financial Times is nothing short of, to use your word earlier, a Russian wish list. That is to say, this is also the maximalist demand list that Putin put forward 3 years ago when he said, if you want to end my special military operation, as it's known in Russia, these are the things that we want, which is, territorial concessions, Ukraine's neutrality, the reduction of its military by more than half, among several other major demands that are big, clear red lines for Kiev.
So let's talk about the vulnerability of Zelensky and how much he's on the ropes because of this scandal in terms of his former partner, his media company, Mindich, who on the lam, I believe, in Israel. He's had to fire the justice minister, and this is clearly not a helpful signal, particularly to the Europeans who have to pick up the slack because the Americans are pulling the plug, that the country still crippled by the legacy of corruption which they inherited from the Russians.
Yeah, you're right. Entrenched corruption has always been a problem here. It has been for every administration. Zelensky's has been no different, unfortunately, for Ukraine. But there are now, unlike when I first arrived in 2010 in Ukraine, institutions that are independent of the government and out of the control of the president. Even they are, a legacy of the 2014 Euromaidan revolution. These are the National Anti-Corruption Bureau of Ukraine, which is a sort of an investigative body, and its sister organization called the Special Anti-Corruption Prosecutor's Office. So NABU and SAPO for short. They came under fire by Zelensky back in July when he tried to strip them of their independence and put them under the control of his handpicked prosecutor general. The public responded just as Ukrainians often do when a leader overreaches, and they went out and protested in the street. And Zelensky reversed course. Since then, those independent anti-corruption bodies have continued their in investigating, and what they found, unfortunately, was corruption that went all the way up to allegedly Zelensky's presidential office. So he has taken certain decisions in firing the energy minister and the justice minister. We've seen the former deputy prime minister, who was already released over the summer in another corruption scandal, also get wrapped up into this, and he's a close ally of Zelensky. And so this is perhaps the most serious domestic moment for him. He's got some really difficult decisions he still needs to make, the Ukrainian public and opposition MPs in parliament, and even some dissenters within Zelensky's own ruling party are saying more heads need to roll. They would like to see his very powerful and controversial chief of staff, Andriy Yermak, dismissed this week. And this has all piled, really, all the pressure on Zelensky at a really critical time when, as I mentioned earlier, the Russians are putting pressure on him in the air, on the battlefield. You've now got Trump oscillating back toward the Russians and applying pressure on him to come to an agreement that is unfavorable to Ukraine. This is Zelensky's, most serious moment. I can't imagine the amount of pressure he must be feeling, but that's where we are. And war and corruption, that's sort of been the dual story of Ukraine in the last 11 years since Russia's first annexation of Crimea and war in the Donbass. And as the country fights, the parallel fight of corruption to root out that entrenched corruption that you mentioned has persisted since its independence more than 30 years ago.
But Zelensky came to power from being a television comedian based upon the notion of anti-corruption, and the character that he played was an ordinary guy that was disgusted and sick of the entrenched corruption in Ukraine. And
Yeah,
yet
you're right.
somehow he's succumbed to it. And Yermak's always been a controversial figure. Some people have even suggested that his loyalty is questionable in terms of sympathy for Russia. So I don't understand that. Why is it because you can't do business in that country without having to accede to a certain amount of corruption?
I think some people would tell you that. I've certainly heard that from many people that a certain level of corruption is needed to keep things running. Is how some people in government, both past and current, have explained it to me. But ultimately the goal is to root out all corruption. And it is ironic that Zelensky came to power on this anti-corruption platform. And I can recall even during one of his campaign adverts, him saying that if you know of corruption, call NABU, the National Anti-Corruption Bureau of Ukraine, which is the same organization that he tried to strip of its independence when they began investigating his inner circle. So I think many Ukrainians and I would count myself among certainly folks who know the country well and know it well enough to say that there's no administration that hasn't to some degree been involved in corruption or had it overshadow their administration, their cabinet. I think there have been worse corruption scandals in the past, but none that have come at such a bad, critical time for the country. They're fighting an existential war, and their biggest political and military backer is speaking very favorably, not of them, but of their adversary.
Well, that's always been so disgraceful on Trump's part, the total amorality that he doesn't recognize that Russia is the villain here, that they've attacked and plundered and tried to destroy and murder a country right next door. The victim he treats with contempt, and the victimizer he treats with kid gloves. So the whole thing is rather bizarre. But it seems to me that Putin's strategy is to wear down the Ukrainians. And now Trump seems to be giving him a gift. But the strategy seems to be that he's hoping that the increased defense budgets that the Western European countries and NATO countries have now had to employ to make up for the slack, because the Americans are pulling the weapons away and that they have to pick up the slack. That's cutting into the traditional social safety programs in these social democracies. And it seems that Putin's strategy is to covertly finance and encourage right-wing parties like the AfD in Germany, Le Pen's party in France, and Nigel Farage in the UK. And he thinks that eventually, by helping the right take over in Europe, who are sympathetic to him for whatever reasons I don't quite understand, and that way will undermine the resolve of NATO or even weaken NATO. And that's his path to victory. How do you see it?
Well, you're well informed. I think all of that is right. I would add that it's certainly my sense that Donald Trump wants to offload this war. He wants to get to a place where he can secure a ceasefire, and I think he views a ceasefire as the end of the war, or the end of any war. I think we could even look at what he's done in Israel and Gaza and say, after his victory tour there, where he secured a ceasefire that's been rather shaky, that he views, that as now a war that he has solved, right? He wants the Russia-Ukraine war to end. He's been very clear about that. He said on numerous occasions, "I want the killing to stop." He views the cessation of hostilities as the end of the war. In reality, there are numerous points that need to be discussed to actually bring the war to an end. Certainly, even more if you want to talk about what Ukraine would consider to be a just end and accountability for Russia's crimes and war of aggression. But I think he wants to get to a point where he can secure a ceasefire and then stop pumping U.S. Military assistance and money into Ukraine, and then essentially hand over Ukrainian support to the Europeans. He's said on numerous occasions that it's essentially a European problem. It's on their continent. And I think he wants to get back, and certainly his team wants to get back to the president focusing on domestic issues here, and having the Europeans worry about Ukraine in the future.
So in the last couple of minutes then, Christopher, let's talk about whether the Europeans, the only people that can pick up the slack here are the Europeans, right? If the Americans are going to sell the country out because Trump wants to wash his hands of it, wants to get his Nobel Peace Prize, and probably wants to get some kind of kickback in terms of deals with Russia, the way that he's dealing with Saudi Arabia, that would mean that they are the only people that can step into the breach or even pick up the slack. Are they going to do it, or can they do it?
There's certainly some slack they can pick up. They've been good in on the finance side. They've provided more money than the United States has to Ukraine. They can do that. It might get trickier going forward, which is why they're hoping the Belgians will come around and approving the use of these Russian frozen assets that could allow up to $300 billion of these assets to be used to arm Ukraine and to help it. That's a short-term problem, though, not a long-term problem. They're still going to have to figure out how to finance Ukraine and keep its economy afloat and its military funded for years to come. Certainly, that can't stop, because even a ceasefire here and any kind of peace deal, let's just say it happens in the very near future, right? Russia is always going to be a persistent threat for Ukraine going forward. and that threat of another invasion would certainly loom large for them. They can help in some ways militarily, but not as much as the United States can. And then the big question is whether Donald Trump not necessarily continues American assistance, which I think we know at this point will probably not persist, and he hasn't approved any new American military assistance since he was president. But if he keeps this new Pearl system, PURL, system open for the Europeans to continue purchasing weapon systems and ammunition for Ukraine to arm it. Right now, Donald Trump sees that as a good deal. Americans don't have to spend taxpayer money being sent to Ukraine for its defense, but rather the Europeans and Ukraine itself can purchase things through this system that Ukraine needs for its defenses. If Donald Trump were to allow that to continue and approve any purchases for Ukraine quickly, efficiently, allowing them to be shipped to Ukraine smoothly without any hiccups and in a timely manner that allows Ukraine to actually plan for months and years ahead, then the Europeans, can pick up a lot of the slack. But it still will be really difficult without the active participation of the United States. And I haven't even begun to mention the intelligence part, and that is that U.S. intelligence really is key in using a lot of this Western weaponry and NATO weaponry that is now in Ukraine's arsenal. It needs also U.S. intelligence to be able to see when attacks are coming. U.S. intelligence really has become, the eyes of the Ukrainian military, and so if Donald Trump were to say, we're also going to end that, or to use it as leverage to get the Ukrainians to come to the table, which he tried doing in the spring, then things could get really tough. And the Europeans, the British in particular, they have some intelligence capabilities, but not to the extent the Americans do, and would certainly have to develop some or find a way of filling that gap. So it would be hard going forward for the Ukrainians with the Americans simply abandoning them and leaving the rest to Europe.
And one wonders whether the Europeans can tell the Ukrainians that you don't have to take this terrible deal. That's, I guess, the real question. I thank you for joining us, Christopher Miller. I appreciate it.
It was my pleasure. Thank you.
And again, I've been speaking with Christopher Miller, who is the Financial Times' chief Ukraine correspondent. He has lived and reported from Ukraine since 2010 and is the author of The War Came to Us, Life and Death in Ukraine, the winner of the 2024 Witold Pilecki International Book Award. His reporting is focused on Ukrainian politics, President Volodymyr Zelensky's relationship with Donald Trump, and various aspects of Russia's war in Ukraine. His work has exposed Russian war crimes and revealed the plight of people forced to live under brutal occupation. And he previously was the world and national security reporter for Politico and the world correspondent for BuzzFeed News in Kyiv. And his latest articles at the Financial Times include U.S. and Russian officials draft new peace plan for Ukraine, and Volodymyr Zelensky's distance himself from allies in wartime graft probe. And this has been Background Briefing. I'm Ian Masters, and I'd like to thank producers Graham Fitzgibbon, Asher Price, and Sasha Linden-Cohen. If you missed any of today's program and would like to explore our vast archives, you can find us at backgroundbriefing.org, where we include extended interviews, searchable by topic, and have made it easier for you to sign up for daily email updates and provide links to resources, articles, and books discussed on the program. Also, you can find links there to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and we highly encourage your ratings and reviews on these platforms. Find us on Twitter, Blue Sky, and Facebook at Ian Masters Media, and our new social media manager, Luke Susswood, is also posting highlights from the show on YouTube, TikTok, and Instagram at Ian Masters Media. So please do help us reach more listeners by sharing this program with friends, family, and colleagues. And to help sustain this program into the future and ensure it remains free to all, please take a moment to support us by going to backgroundbriefing.org/donate and/or at publictruthmedia.org, where your tax-deductible donations, large and small, keep us broadcasting. And I'll be back tomorrow with another Background Briefing at backgroundbriefing.org. Bye for now.